how do you explain the human psyche, and why is it so important for people to understand theirs?
Well, that's a very large question to start with. The human psyche represents, at some level, all that we are. It's actually, the word psyche is a Greek word, and it meant soul originally. So we are an animal that seemingly has energies that we identify as spiritual in nature, as expressive as soul, and we're creatures with a body and with emotional life and so forth. So we're pretty complex beings. So, how we track that, how we try to map that, we try to make sense of our life has been a project for millennia now. So, we'll see where this conversation takes us today, what we will learn about ourselves.
And from what I understand, the psyche is kind of divided into a few parts. There's the ego, there's the shadow, and then there's the self. Am I correct? And
yeah, well, when Jung was trying to track those energies, he divided them or tried to label them in order to make them conscious, help us explain or understand what they were trying to do. It's important to think of each of those words as a verb, not a noun. If it's a noun, it'll show up on your MRI or your X-ray, but they're metaphors to talk about the different functions of the human being. And the word ego, which is Latin for I, is who I think I am at any given moment. Of course, who I am at any given moment is going to vary a great deal. I might be sound asleep. I might be caught in a complex. I might be very focused on something. The self was his designation for the sort of architecture and sort of roadmap of the organism. The self is an activity. It's growing our toenails. It's birthing new cells as old cells die. It's emoting. It's thinking. It's doing all kinds of things. So we often think who we are is what we think we are, as opposed to the totality of our being. So the ego is a part of the psyche that's split off and is capable of self-reflection, capable of consciousness. That's helpful. That's what allows us to look both ways before we cross the street, or to make executive decisions and have plans. We arrived at the same time for our appointment today. That was the ego functioning the way it's supposed to. But the self is sort of the organic nature that is seeking to unfold through us into the world. Just as the apricot is trying to become the apricot, so the organism that we are seeking to express itself in this world, and does so sometimes as a function of whatever environment it's working within. And sometimes, as we know, we get allied against ourselves. And we often are the animal that does damage to our own selves, as we know.
So is what drives our self and the way we act, is it the shadow and the ego at the root of it, and that's like influencing how we behave?
Well, Jung's concept of the shadow represents those parts of our personality that we would like to disown or like to ignore or perhaps project onto other people. Over 2,000 years ago, it was observed I can see the speck in your eye and ignore the log in my own, which is saying I'm disowning my lesser qualities, or the ones I do not wish to address, and putting them out there on you. This is the origin of bigotry, for example. This is the origin of animosity toward other people, and so forth. So probably the best thing ever said about the shadow came from the Latin playwright Terence 2 millennia ago, who said, "Nothing human is alien to me." So it's not pleasing to my ego to say, well, I'm capable of violence, or I'm capable of jealousy, or I'm capable of self-interest in a way that's harmful to others. But, I'm not exempt from the human story. So sooner or later, whatever is human within us winds up in the world and in our relationships and so forth. So the shadow problem is a problem for all of us. And collectively, it's a problem between nations and between various organizations that produce conflict and tension and so forth. So the shadow may be the source of evil, but it's not evil per se. It's our humanity, many aspects of which we would prefer not to address, as I mentioned. So that's simply a kind of task for the ego. The stronger, more mature the ego, the more it can recognize these impulses within us. In other words, in our relationships, how many times are we operating out of self-interest, of jealousy, for example, or controlling motives? Those are shadow tasks that each of us has to face sooner or later.
And so how do we begin to understand our ego and sense of self so that we can continue to work on it. And like you said, make the ego stronger and more mature so that we can have a better life, more happiness, and more sense of purpose.
Well, I think, first of all, the concept of accountability. We have to recognize that the one person that is present in all the scenes of our long melodramatic life is ourselves. So we're accountable for what spills into the world through us. We'd like to blame at times. We'd like to disown responsibility, but I am responsible for the choices I make. And even those coming from the unconscious are still part of my being, and I'm responsible for them as well. Now, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So I cannot literally say at the moment what that's about. It's still something for which I am accountable. I can't just say, well, I wasn't paying attention to where that was really coming from in me. Question I often ask my clients through the years is, of a certain behavior or a certain pattern in their lives, now what is that in service to inside of you? I may have done what I think is a justifiable thing or a good thing, but maybe it came from codependence. Maybe it came from fear-based motive. I need to know from whence it's coming. What is it really in service to? And that often is not apparent at first glance. It's something that I have to pay attention to and try to track as best I can.
I think at the root of all this is really understanding like where these patterns and behaviors kind of come from. I know for me, a big part of my transformation was understanding how my childhood impacted the way I behaved as a teenager, impacted the way I behaved as an adult, so that I could be able to take responsibility for, my side of the street, if you will, and work on the things that I needed to work on in order to like kind of leave my childhood behind, if you will. Talk about the importance of understanding like how you grew up as it relates to how we behave as adults.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's kind of like a New Yorker cartoon. Someone comes and lies on a couch and complains about mom and dad. It's not really that way. However, when you reflect upon it, what first influenced your sense of self, your sense of world, and how you relate to each other? That starts in childhood. It starts at home. Even the infant and the young child is looking at the world and saying, well, are you safe? Are you unsafe? Can I express myself, or does that make things worse? Or how do you see me? Do you value me as I am, or I have to make adaptations and twist myself in some way to become acceptable to you? A child is reflecting on those things without necessarily being conscious about them. We survive through adaptation. And what am I adapting to? Is my nurtured environment affirmative? Is it consistent? Is it present in a constructive way most of the time? Or is it the reverse? And so you used a phrase a while ago, sense of self. And that's an important distinction between the self, which is the organic nature of our being that's expressing itself through our choices, through our body, etc. But my sense of self is often derivative from what I interpret. So I'll give you, some examples. If my parents are caught up with their own problems, if they're, pushed by hardship and so forth, they will have to be spending a lot of time trying to deal with those issues and not dealing with me as a needful child. I can internalize that as a kind of distrust of people, or I can internalize that I wasn't worth spending time with. Now, those are false conclusions, but they're the only game in town for the child. So he or she is bound to internalize to some degree, I'm what happened to me. Or, why, for example, would a child be scarred by poverty or dis-ease or alcoholism or something like that? Well, it's because every child is, again, sensitive to his environment and in some way is internalizing what's happening as somehow a statement to me about me. And of course, if you're born into this family or this culture or this time and place in history, you're going to have a whole different sense of self. And it's very provisional, but again, no matter how tall the skyscraper, you always go through the bottom floors to get to the top. So those childhood experiences, I've often said to people, how thrilled would you be to realize a choice you just made, a behavior, was coming out of that frightened 8-year-old that you once were, or the 4-year-old? You wouldn't turn your automobile over to a child. You'd say you're not old enough to drive the automobile. But unconsciously, reflexively, the child is often driving our lives. in terms of compliant behaviors or avoidant behaviors or power complexes or whatever. And I had a client years ago who was in training to become an analyst, and he said, I was shocked to realize how almost no one thinks well of themselves. And I said, that's true, because we've internalized, life's difficulties and the fortuities of this family or that family as being about ourselves, rather. And as a result, people walk into the world often feeling very inferior or feeling unworthy or lacking permission to have their lives. They're often more concerned about, how do I fit in? How do I stay out of harm's way? Perfectly understandable for the child. But as these things get internalized, they become reflexive systems. It's like computer operating systems. That becomes your operating system. Are you constantly needing to please someone? Are you needing to stay out of conflict? What are the core messages that come to you? And from that, the patterns emerge. So I've said to individuals before, you wake in the morning and you don't say to yourself, well, today I'm going to do the same stupid, counterproductive things I've done for decades, but by day's end, there's a good chance you will. And why? Because these deeply buried, emotionally charged ideas, which is what Jung meant by complexes, these complexes are pretty systemic within us. And we need to start being aware of them. We need to start identifying what they are, what they make us do, or what they keep us from doing. And that's the beginning of self-wisdom, self-insight. And if you don't do that kind of work, you're likely to become a prisoner of whatever happened around you.
And so once we begin to understand what happened in our childhood and how it impacts the way we feel about ourselves, the way we see the world, the way we talk to ourselves, like what can people do about that? Because I think sometimes people get kind of lost where they're like, all right, I've gone back and I've understood, something my mother said to me or my father or kids around me or whatever the example is. They're like, well, how do I use something that happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago? Like, how do I transcend that to improve my life today?
Well, as I suggested a few minutes ago, it leads to a very practical question. What does that issue make you do? In other words, how does it produce itself as behaviors that you're indulging in? Or what is it keeping you from doing that your life calls you to do? See, if a person is going to work on him or herself, that person has to be willing to look at that and spend some effort. You don't necessarily see it overnight. You have to begin to really track these patterns. We don't do crazy things. We do logical things based on the intrapsychic premise. That is to say, what's the emotional picture or script from your history that's been triggered here? Now, some of our scripts are useful. That's why I said you look both ways before you cross the street. That's a useful script. But there's some others that come up and force you to play out an old role. And every time you play it out, you're going to reinforce it. That's why the old joke, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, only one, but the bulb has to want to change, Well, the point here is, we say we want to change, we want to grow, we want to develop, we want to be freer. Okay, do so, but it's going to take some hard work. If I throw something at your direction, you're naturally going to put your hands up to protect yourself. That's what many of these reflexes or complexes are about. They're protective, but they also bind a person to that disabling past and that repetitive past. That's why, in some way, the more we repeat these things, the more deeply programmed they are within us. That's why one reason why change is so difficult. Another example is I cannot overemphasize the degree to which some of our behaviors are really fear-based resolutions. As I say, give them what they want, even if it's at the cost of your integrity, or just stay away, just stay out of harm's way, don't even speak up. Those are protective mechanisms that were perhaps necessary for a child, but for an adult, they undermine the adult's capacities and the adult's resilience. Then you begin to realize we are prisoners of the past to the degree, number one, we're not aware of its influence. And secondly, even when we are, it has a staying power. The truth is, as Jung pointed out, we don't necessarily solve these problems, but he said we can outgrow them. That's a big difference, because you don't cut out of your history everything that ever happened. It's still there. It's still influential, but it has a reflexive character, and we have to start being able to catch it, or catch it as soon as possible. That reduces some of the damage. And we can't live with integrity as a full human being who knows what's going on and is making the proper choices for himself or herself until you're aware of some of these triggers and some of the mechanisms that we acquired along history's highway here.
Do you think that this work has to be done with a therapist, or have you found there to be like tools for people to implement on their own to be able to like kind of gain some awareness around their behaviors, where they're coming from, whether it's journaling, whether it's meditation? Like, what have you found to be effective?
Well, I think it's both. There's no formula for this. I've spent a good part of my life as a teacher, and I've written 20 books. And I always say that because I think of books as a classroom. And so I've been seeking to share some of these insights and examples with people so that they can help themselves. It certainly can be helpful to spend time with a thoughtful and appropriately prepared professional. That depends on the person and the life situation. There's no one formula for all. The word therapy comes from a Greek word that means to listen or attend to. And if psyche means soul, it's like it means paying attention to or listening to the needs of your own soul. That sort of depathologizes it and says, well, that's an important consideration, isn't it? So psychotherapy is an attitude, a practice, a discipline, whether you work with another person or not. And not many people spend a lot of time reflecting on, well, where did that come from? Why did I react that way yesterday? Why was I so angry with my partner? Why did I say that to my child? If people don't stop and ask those questions, they're just going to be creatures of automatic responses. Reflexive, trigger, stimulus, response, stimulus, response, and that's how those patterns build up. So it takes some courage and sometimes some desperation, or someone getting in our face saying, look, you're hurtful to me for these reasons. And we need to be able to understand that. So ironically, this is not about self-absorption. It's about, improving our sense of personal governance. And the best thing I can do for others is actually in the long run to work on myself. Otherwise, what's unconscious in me keeps spilling onto other people.
And one of the things I've heard a lot in the context of the word ego is it's here to protect us and keep us safe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then also, how can we as humans get better with our relationship to fear?
Well, first of all, the ego is the executor of consciousness. And so we, as I said, we got here in the same day and the right time and so forth. That was our ego functioning appropriately. It's your executive function. You need it. Don't confuse that with egotism or egoism, which is self-absorption. What we're talking about is consciousness. Now, that said, we're not conscious very much of any given day. Much of the time, when we're operating, we're on these automatic pilots. We're serving these scripts that we've just been talking about. I've said, one of the few times we're really conscious every day is when you step in the shower in the morning. And if you find it's too hot or you're too cold, you make a proper adjustment of the water's temperature. That's the ego serving its proper function, interrelating you in an appropriate response to the world outside. We also have to say that the ego is often an occupied state when it's under the influence of these other scripts that we all carry within us, some of which are productive, but many of which are reductive and keep us bound to our history. Now, one of which, of course, is dealing with fear. Fear itself is not abnormal. If we had no fear, we'd just walk across the street right into the traffic. We would not be able to protect ourselves. It's one thing to have fear. It's something else to have a fearful life. That is to say, a life governed by fear-based responses. And, the message of childhood is overlearned at some level. And that is, I'm tiny, the world's big, I'm powerless, and the world is powerful. And so the child learns either to be consumed with power, complexes, or to, again, giving the world what it wants, and therefore you lose your own legitimate entitlements, or you spend your life avoiding conflict. Jung said once something that I think of every day, literally. He said, "The spirit of evil is negation of the life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear, and if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated." Now that puts it right there at the center of things. And I've said to folks, type that up, put it on your bathroom mirror so you look at it every day. It begins to make you more conscious, more attuned to the fact that some of your behaviors are old fear-based responses, such as avoidance, or such as trying to control others and so forth. And when you do, then you see you're less a prisoner of history. Don't underestimate the power of historic conditioning. It's not everything, but it's certainly a lot, especially if consciousness is not paying much attention. Ultimately, all of us have to face what we fear and address it. And we also need to know that nature has equipped us with the energies, with the resilience, with the capacity to get through so many things that we would never think we get through. As you know, you often learn the most important things about yourself through conflict and suffering. It's not pleasant, it's painful, but you still learn that you have something within you that carries you through. There's an old saying, I think it was from Tibet, but I may be wrong there, that said, "And why do you think that your life ought to be easier than that which was true for those who went before you?" And you realize, life is difficult. The body hurts. You suffer emotional losses in your life. You're an immortal creature speeding towards your own dissolution. Welcome to the human condition. The best you can do is find the courage, insight, and wherewithal to take it on. And when you do, it gives you a sense of life's purpose. It gives you a sense of ownership of your own life. Two things I found for most people that become critical to the second half of life, and I'm using the term half of life pretty loosely here. One is most people don't feel permission to their own life because, again, as a child, you learn, how people treat you is conditional. You have to meet the conditions. So people don't feel like they're entitled to pursue the things that really matter to them. They feel like, I have to fit in. I have to be acceptable to others. That's perfectly understandable. But it also keeps you from your own life. The second point that is so difficult in the second half of life, but essential to address, is to sort through and find your own personal authority. At any given moment, our ego structure is bombarded with differing values, different scripts, different admonitions. And which of those voices, if you will, comes from your own depths and which are acquired by your history or presented to you by your family of origin or your culture? And to sort through that traffic and to say, but this is what is true for me. And finding the courage to live it. That's what brings us back to our own journey. That's how personal authority. Jung said once in a letter that there are three pieces to this kind of work. First is insight, however you get it, with a therapist or on your own. Second and thirdly, he said, come the sort of moral qualities of the individual. Second is courage to take on your own life. Say, this is my life. I have to live it in a way that makes sense to me. It's not selfish. It's honoring the self. There's a difference. And thirdly, he said, is endurance, persistence, sticking it out over time. And when you do, then you realize your life becomes more and more your journey. And it's rich and it's meaningful. Not free of conflict, not free of suffering and loss, but rich and meaningful. And if one doesn't do that work, then we're still, in some way, creatures of history, creatures of those adaptations.
One of the hardest, I think, things for people to look at within the context of everything that you're saying is the shadow, their shadow. It's the darkest parts of their human behavior. It's the parts they're most ashamed of. What advice do you have for somebody to get more accepting of their shadow? And then what are a few ways they can transform their relationship to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, welcome to the human race. And that's why I quoted Terence a short while ago. I said, where he said, nothing human is alien to me. So I've said to people, what makes you think that you're exempt from humanity? You're not. You're part of humanity. And all that is good and all that is not so good in humanity is part of us. We're all capable of jealousy, of envy, of selfishness, of manipulation of others, even of violence. And you need to know that, because if you don't know it, it's going to show up unconsciously. It's going to be part of the interactive field between you and others because it's operating unconsciously. I remember a number of years ago, when I lived in New Jersey, there was a statewide dental association had billboards all over the state that said, ignore your teeth and they'll go away. Well, ignore the shadow and it'll go away. No, it won't. It'll come out repetitively in your relationships with others. And if you want to clean up your relationship, you start with yourself. I mean, there's a secret to relationships is they never get better than our relationship to ourselves. Where I'm stuck, where I'm caught in my insecurities, where I'm caught in my old adaptive patterns, plays out with my partner, plays out with my children. And therefore, that's why I said this work is not selfish. It's becoming accountable. And when I'm accountable, I'm beginning to lift some of that off of others. Quick example. Jung also said something that should haunt us if we're parents every day. He said the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. That is to say, where I am unconscious, where I'm stuck. That's the legacy I'm giving the child. That's the model I'm giving them. That's the permission I'm giving them. So to live my life with as much integrity and accountability as I can opens that door for my children too. And also to live it with a certain measure of risk, because if I continue to be boxed in by my fears, they will be too. Or they'll be spending their life trying to break away from that. Either way, it's because of the unfinished business of the parent that they are burdened with that. So the best thing you can do for your child is live a fuller, richer life that has integrity for you. And also, and a good example of shadow is how often parents expect children to make them feel good about themselves. That is, say, I expect my child to endorse my values, turn out, surprise, surprise, come like me. If they are going to form partnership, to come home and bring somebody acceptable to me, maybe have my religious values, my cultural values, vote for my candidate, etc. Well, why do you think we spend so much time helping people trying to get away from all of those parental complexes? It's because the parents have been unconscious with that. If you're going to help your children, your friends, well, you take that on yourself. And when you take it on, you're freeing them up to live their journey. Now, talk is cheap. This is a kind of continuing relationship. So many today, I was just reading an article yesterday about how many parents are interfering with their college students children who are gone away, and they have to make their own mistakes. They have to find their own way. But the unconscious message, those parents who claim they love the children, is that, well, we really don't think you can manage things on your own. So we have to make those decisions for you. Well, that's a disabling message. And that's coming out of the parents' anxiety, not out of a genuine caring for that child. So sooner or later, every child has to find his or her way and grow up, make mistakes, learn from that. That's how we learned. And so ultimately, your task, without being selfish about this, is to live your life, be the best model you can, and maybe your children will have that opportunity as well. Otherwise, you're burdening them.
I think people are often looking for kind of quick fixes or quick answers, if you will. So with that said, do you think that like the biggest sign that somebody's relationship to themselves is quote unquote off or needs some real work is that the relationships around them, whether it's with their partner, with their kids, are falling apart?
Sure. And underneath all of this, again, is that central message that I mentioned a while ago. No relationship with another is better than how we're related to our own material. Because where I'm stuck, where I'm blocked, where I'm governed by fear or power complexes, that's what shows up in the relationship. So that's why the best way to clean up a relationship is to work on oneself. And, often it's the person who's dragged into therapy who is afraid to look at themselves. And that's why it's so difficult. You have to be able to bear looking at yourself and being responsible for what you see. If you don't, you're going to be stuck forever. You're going to be doing harm to people around you, whether you know it or not. And thirdly, sooner or later, they're either going to have to break through that and maybe address that relationship in a very dramatic way, or they'll get stuck in the same mess you are. So, we all have infantile needs. We would love to have somebody take care of us. We would love to have somebody protect us. We would love to have somebody read our minds and say, well, let me fix that for you. Well, that's a flight from being accountable myself. And so the more that kind of agenda is playing out, that's why so many relationships fail. We ask too much of them and so little of ourselves. So, it's like, if I'm not accountable for my own growth and development, why am I asking my children to carry that? Why am I asking my partner to carry that? Maturity is about being accountable for whatever is spilling into the world through me. And a lot of what's spilling through the world through me, as we've said, is unconscious. So again, the problem with the unconscious is unconscious. Well, start with the patterns that you see in your relationship. Start with the patterns you have that are perhaps self-sabotaging. Why are you doing that? There's always a reason, maybe a lousy reason, maybe a bad reason, but there's a reason that you're doing that. You have to identify what that reason is, work backwards to say, all right, if I have a pattern where I'm constantly sort of wanting to do something, but for reasons I don't know, I'm putting it off, automatically say there's an issue there of permission. Do you really have permission for your own life? Are you being blocked by fear? What is it you're going to have to face to push through that to get to the place where you step into your own life's journey? Jung said once, we all walk in shoes too small for us. Well, what does that mean? It means we've learned these adaptive patterns in childhood, and they continue to govern the personality throughout a lifetime. These things don't go away. We either outgrow them, confront them, or they stay in charge of our lives.
The word purpose has become popularized over the last, I don't know, at least 5 to 10 years or so. You're turning your pain into purpose, living a life full of meaning, following your passions, etc. And there's a lot of people that they don't have purpose in life. They feel lost. They feel afraid. How can somebody begin to discover like what they're meant to be here for, like what their life's purpose actually is?
Okay. Well, first of all, you'd have to say, where does your purpose come from? Because often the purpose that people grow up with is perhaps understandably to please their parents or to fit in, to avoid stepping into the largeness of their journey. Well, their purpose then is avoidance, or their purpose is compliance. We need to recognize, first of all, nature has given us many clues as to what is right for us. And I'm one of those who doesn't think that the goal of life is happiness, because happiness is transitory, it's contextual. If you're dying of thirst in the desert, what's going to make you happy is a glass of water. Too much water, you drown, you see. It's very contextual, and it's short-lived. It's a poor judgment of life. What is more important is to have a sense of purposefulness. Now, where does that come from? First of all, we have these elemental functions that we all have, but we learn to sort of take them for granted, one of which is the feeling function. I'll give you an example. Midlife, I had done all the things I thought were important for me to do. I'd achieved them in the outer world. And yet I found myself in a depression. And for the first time, I had to begin to question, if I've done all the right things, why has my energy departed? Why has the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support? What is wanting some corrective or new expression in my life? And that's what was the first time I ever went into therapy. It didn't feel like the beginning of the second half of my life. It felt like a kind of defeat. But it was a discrepancy between doing all the right things and the feeling function. You don't control your feelings. They are autonomous responses by your nature to what you're doing. And sooner or later, if you don't pay attention to them, it will begin to pathologize and produce symptoms. Secondly, are energy systems. You can mobilize energy systems, and you have to do that to earn a living. You don't have to stop and say on Monday morning, do I stay in bed all day, or do I get up and go to my job? You go to your job because it's serving a lot of good purposes. If over time you keep doing the wrong things, it will lead to burnout. We all know that. It will lead to burnout, to boredom. It'll lead down the line to self-medication. It'll lead down the line to depression. So energy system, when you're doing what's right for you, the energy is there. I'm 84 now, and I am aching of body and spirit. And at the same time, I enjoy doing what I do as a therapist and as a teacher. So that's why we're here talking today. That the energy is available because it's the right thing for me, as defined by my psyche, not by my ego. Thirdly, we pay attention to dreams. If you've reached 80 years old, sleep research tells us that you will dream 6 years of your life. Not sleep. That could be up to a third of those 80 years. But dreaming is 6 years out of 80 years old. And nature doesn't waste energy. If you pay attention to them over time, you'll see that your psyche, in addition to processing the stimuli of everyday life, is also trying to communicate some things to you. It doesn't tap out as telex saying do this and drop that. But if you pay attention in time, you'll realize there's some intelligence inside of you. There's something in you that knows you better than you know yourself, and it's trying to communicate with you. Pay attention to it, and you begin to develop that inner authority. And fourthly is the question of meaning. Just because the world says the purpose of life is to make a lot of money, okay, we'll go do that. But and I know an awful lot of miserable human beings who have enough money in their life, but they're often miserable for a lot of other reasons because their psyche, their soul is not satisfied by their bank account. It's far more complex than that. So if something is meaningful to you, the rightness of it is something that you will be carried by. As a child, I would have thought what my life was about to be a Major League Baseball player, like a lot of children. But, I wasn't given that body to do that. I would have never imagined that I would spend my life listening to people's issues, their problems, their suffering. And yet today, as I sit here, I can't imagine a more meaningful way to spend my life than to be part of people's journey and to share that with them. Now, that wasn't my choice. It was a choice made by the soul. And it was partly at midlife as a result of being in my own therapy. I switched from a life of academia to a life in which I began to spend my time with individuals who are in distress in their journeys. And I found that far more meaningful than I did living in the university setting. So again, meaning is not a choice of the ego. It's something coming from the soul. And if we give ourselves to it, we will find ourselves being supported from something inside of us. Then you're living in harmony with yourself. You're not free of conflict. You're not free of suffering. You're not free of mortality. But your life is carried by a sense of purposefulness. There was a poet named, I can't think of his last name, Jack, it'll come to me later, in which he said, find what you love and let it kill you. It's a strange, paradoxical statement, but there's truth to it. It's not about following your bliss. Find what matters to you most and give your energies there as much as you can. And you'll find that the byproduct of that is meaningful to you. That's not something invented. It's something you experience, and you either experience it or you don't.
People have a hard time finding meaning and purpose in things like pain, adversity. Talk a lot about that on the show. How can people have a better relationship with pain, with hardship, and find meaning in that?
Well, a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Swamplands of the Soul. It dealt with those difficult times like depression, loss, betrayal, addiction, guilt, and so forth. And I said, sooner or later, life will take us to those places. And you'll feel like a victim, like something awful has happened to you. And yes, it is awful. But it's important to realize in each of those swampland visitations, there is a task, the identification of which and the addressing of which will lead you from victimage to active engagement with your life. So when I experienced that midlife depression, well, I had to ask myself over a period of time, what's pressed down? What's wanting expression through you? What parts of your personality have been pushed aside or repressed? That's what you have to give more life to right now. A number of years ago, the last 4 years, I've been to 2 cancers and 2 very large spinal surgeries. I spent an enormous amount of time in an enormous amount of pain. And yet, I found my relationship with my wife. I found my relationship to my work sustaining, supportive, and challenging. And as I sit here right now, I'm not comfortable physically, but I'm also finding the conversation something that's important for me to address. And so in that process, you move, as I said, from being a victim to an active participant. We can't spare ourselves suffering. That comes to us. That's part of being a human being. But then the question is, what do I need to bring to the table then? And to recognize that within each of us, nature again has given us a spirit, which is the resilient capacity to step back into life. A client years ago who had spent most of her life in avoidance, and she was a fearful and avoidant person. And then she realized she was dying of a cancer, and she came into therapy knowing she had months to live. And as a result of our conversations, she began to take on the things that she feared. And she said, and I've never forgotten this, she said, I wish I would have learned this earlier in my life, would have made a big difference. But she said, I realize that I don't have to be afraid anymore. And this is the best time of my life. And I found that remarkable. Today, I understand that at a deeper level than I could have at the time. But I understood that she was no longer governed by her fears. She was living her life with as much richness as she could imagine. She repaired some relationships. She traveled. She did some things that in the past she was afraid of doing. So again, sooner or later, we have to step into our life. And when you do, you'll find something that supports you in that process. You also said, and I think about this every day, he asked the question, what supports you when nothing supports you? And that's what we all have to find. And I found that through the years. And I certainly found it put to trial in the last few years going through these medical circumstances. But here I am, and I'm engaged with my journey, and I find it as rich or richer than any time before.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and congrats on overcoming those health issues. I'm sure it was incredibly scary, and I'm glad that you found like meaning and purpose in that. And with that said, do you think that is like, I don't want to say the blueprint because it's obviously very individual, but would you say that people tend to, especially as they get later on in their life, find meaning and purpose in the non-material things, the relationship to themselves, like the what they do outside, like things like that?
Well, sure. There are two major treatment plans in the modern world for if you don't know what your life's about and what you want to do with your life. There are two treatment plans. One is materialism. Go out and buy the latest shiny thing. Okay, we'll go do it. Most people have. We're using a computer right now. I have an iPhone, et cetera, et cetera. Buy those shiny things. See how long the payoff lasts and becomes something you don't even think about anymore. So materialism is a failed source of life's enhancement. Yeah, it's nice to have some tools, right? On the other hand, it doesn't really, in the long run, nurture your soul. And the other treatment plan of our time and culture is diversion. Back in the 17th century, the French philosopher and actual inventor, he partly invented calculus, Blaise Pascal said, even the court, with all their privileges, he said, grew miserable if they encountered their own souls. And he said, therefore, the court had to invent the jester. And he said this was their divertissement, French word that means diversion. What is it we're diverting from? We're diverting from the reality of our own souls on a journey. And those are the treatment plans, by and large. Well, I should add a third, and that's narcosis, whether it's food or drugs or booze or whatever. If life is difficult, go buy something. When the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. Or secondly, get lost in the diversions of popular culture. Or number three, get stoned. All three of which, in the end, fail to have any sustaining power. They can be tempting up front, but in the long run, do they work? The answer is clearly no. Sooner or later, we have appointments with ourselves, radical appointments. And the question is, are you going to keep the appointment or not?
How do we schedule these appointments on a regular basis? Like, what's your advice for that?
Well, first of all, you don't always schedule them. Sometimes they come to you, as it did me at depression at midlife, or later with health crises. But I do think there are things that on a daily basis, I think we need to set aside a little bit of time every day. And of course, people say, I don't have time for that. I've got to get the kids off to this. I've got to go do this. Well, then, all right, don't complain when things don't work well for you. If you don't think your own psyche is worth, your own soul is worth some attention, then I can't help you in any way. So I would say, if you can, to the best of your ability, you spend the first 30 minutes saying, did I dream last night? What was my dream about? What do I think those images mean to me? Or spend some time reflecting on your behaviors yesterday or the day before. Where did that come from in me? What was that in service to inside of me? Think about what is calling for your life investments, apart from paying the bills, apart from taking care of children and so forth. In other words, if you don't think you're worth spending some time on in reflection and sort of saying, but where did that come from in me? What is that about? Where does that come from in my history? Where have I been here before? If you don't spend that kind of time, you're going to be an automatic pilot, and you're going to be living what is essentially a fugitive life. If you're a fugitive, what are you running from? What are you running from? That's the question. And where are you bound by fear or lack of permission? And once you as an adult begin to reflect on that, then you realize, well, I have to step up to the plate, don't I? I have to say, I can't let fear continue to dictate my life. If I don't feel permission, guess what? I have to grab hold of it. It's one of the few virtues of mortality. We have to realize we're not here very long. If you think you can put this off and then face yourself at the end, well, it's a little late to make changes then, isn't it? The worst part of dying is to realize I haven't lived my life. That's the hardest part of dying. Right now, as I face mortality, my first concern is for my wife. I want to be here to be helpful to her in various ways, and I care for her. Secondly, I'm still curious. I'm still growing. It's a wonderful time to be alive. There's so much to learn. Thirdly, it's a grand mystery, isn't it? We'll figure it out when we figure it out. But I'm not afraid of death per se. I don't want to have pain. Nobody wants to have pain. But I'm not afraid of dying because I think I've lived my journey as best I can. And I'm continuing to try to do that to the best of my ability. I have a de facto motto that says, very simple, shut up, suit up, show up. Shut up, I say to myself, don't complain, don't whine. There are people who have far worse lives than you have at this point. You know, their children are dying. They don't have food on the table. They don't have shelter. They're in grave pain. You have no real problem. Just shut up. I say it to myself, not to others. Secondly, suit up means do your homework. You want something to change? Don't expect it to fall out of the sky on your head. Do what you need to do. Prepare for your work. Prepare for what you need to change. Figure it out. Thirdly, just show up, not show off. Do the best you can. Step into life. Stop beating up on yourself. Stop judging yourself. Just accept your vanity. I have on my computer printer here a quote from Odysseus from 2,700 years ago. It says, and if the heaving sea has shaken my raft to pieces, then I will swim. Now, why do I have that there? Just a little reminder from 2.5 millennia ago. Shut up, suit up, show up, do your best. If your old structure, your raft falls to pieces, well, swim and get to where you need to get one way or the other.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, on like some things that you either took for granted in your 20s or 30s that you look back now and you're like, wow, I wish I would have spent more time on this, or things that you thought were more meaningful and important to you back then that you've looked back on and been like, like I really wasted time and energy on this. What would those things be for you?
Well, I think that's true for a lot of us. As I said, I did all the right things that I thought was the right things. They weren't wrong. They were just okay for that stage of life. And that's why I think my psyche withdrew its approval. And that's why I had to, go back to the drawing board in my 30s. I wish I'd recognized my parents' sacrifice for me more. And thank them more. They're gone now, and I can't thank them. I've been very much aware of that. I also think I was governed, as most people are, too much to wanting to fit in, to be acceptable to others. And you don't have to be egocentric to say, but each of us is different. Each of us has a different journey. And if we don't see that modeled, and if we don't see others living that, we have to find our way to do that. And, I think I've said to various people, look, the first half of life is pretty much a large, unavoidable mistake. You can't help it. You go out there, you do dumb things, you make mistakes. So pull your socks up, try to do better next time. I love a sentence from Samuel Beckett, one of his novels, and he said, failed? Well, fail again, fail better, right? That's a pretty good motto too, It's like, we're all screw-ups in life, and just accept that. Welcome to the human club. But you get up, you dust yourself off, and you show up tomorrow as best you can. It takes courage, it takes persistence, and it takes caring that something matters to you in such a way that you're willing to commit yourself to. And if you're not doing that now, when are you going to do it?
I'm thinking another example of this, another flavor of this when it comes to like regret, wasting time, etc., is I think about the person. I've been in recovery for almost 16 years, and I think about the person that has spent years or even decades just wasting their life away with either drugs or substances or even just from inaction and fear and stuff. And they feel that their life is just going to be like this forever because of the years and years of debauchery they have gone through and the patterns they've created within their brain. Like, what is your message to them on how they can maybe remain more optimistic and hopeful as they're trying to figure out how they can start to improve their lives?
Well, first of all, the world is full of examples of people who turn themselves around, and you're apparently one of them. So that's something you can share with people or model that with others. Secondly, as the old saying is, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. And sometimes people have found the richest part of their life through their recovery or through stepping into their life or recognizing the old fear-based life is just too small for you. Stop falling into that old place. Get up, pull your socks up, and do the best you can tomorrow. So, I've known people who really began to live in their last years. I gave you the example of the person dying of cancer. There are many people I know. Most of the people I'm working with right now are over 50. And they are all people in the business of changing their lives. And sometimes they've had outwardly very productive lives. But in some way, it was like following the instructions they got from their family or their culture. And they realize, everyone has a richer interior life than they knew about. We're probably closer to it in childhood, but you have no powers as a child to live them out. So you have to sort of fit in. And yeah, a good part of our life is wasted. Is that really an excuse to continue to do that? I don't think so. Life is short, and all that's asked of you is to try to be yourself, be respectful for others. We're not talking about self-absorption or narcissism here. Quite the contrary. It's about your best service to others is being yourself. That's the gift you bring to the table. So sooner or later, you have to decide, is this my life or is it not? And if it's my life, I'm accountable for it. If I continue to narcotize that, if I continue to be dominated by fear, well, unfortunately, that's a wasted life. Somehow, life is seeking an expression through us. We're servants to life, whether we know it or not. And life sometimes wants to take us to places we didn't even know about. I certainly have lived a life I couldn't have imagined. However, it's not necessarily going to be easy. You have to cooperate. And that means you have to stop running and you face yourself and you try to show up tomorrow in the best way you can. Now, talk is cheap. That's difficult. If it weren't difficult, we'd all do it. But sooner or later, you realize, this is not about your ego. This is about serving something that matters to you. This is about something where you realize it's not what does the world want of me. That's the first half of life agenda. It's what is wanting to be expressed through me. That's a different question. Because in the end, you're either a servant of life or you're a servant of your history. Either way, you're a servant, and you better figure out what's worthy of your service.
We spent a lot of the conversation talking about various things, and one of which is obviously human behavior and like the dark side of human behavior and where that stems from. I think one of the things that I think most people, I would say if not all people, have either struggled with or have struggled with at some point in their lives is taking things personally when somebody mistreats them. Now, I know we've covered the shadow, we've covered the ego, we've covered human behavior. Any other insights for people to, I guess, better accept the fact that the way somebody treats them isn't necessarily about them?
Well, that's absolutely the case. It's one of the hardest things. For example, particularly when there's been physical or psychological abuse. I mean, how could I say that's not about you? Because it happened to you. Well, ironically, it wasn't about you. It was someone else's problem. A problem that imposed itself upon you, yes, but you're not what happened to you. That's why I said before, we all tend to look at our world and say, what's going on in my world is somehow a statement to me about me, but it's not. If you were born in a different time, a different place, a different culture, a different family, the message to you would be entirely different. But beyond all that, there's something inherently you. No one has lived like you on this planet heretofore, because each of us is unique. And therefore you have to say, what happened to me was not about me. What is about me is whether I can in some way serve the life force in me that is wanting expression in the world. You know, it's a terrible thing when people have, gender identification issues or sexual preferences or whatever the case might be, and their world is opposed to them in some way. You have to learn to care for yourself and realize that we come from nature or divinity, whichever metaphor you prefer, and your service to that is what you're called for, not serving the voices that are in the culture around you, because most of those are fear-based, most of those are trying to produce compliance and so forth, all of which has to do with their fears and not with your fears at all. My parents were wonderful people, but they grew up in poverty. They had no sense of permission for their life. Their message to me, and it was well meant and it was productive for them, unfortunately for them, it was productive, and that was, don't go out there. It's too dangerous. Stay home. We'll try to take care of ourselves. Circle the wagons. And if I had done that, I wouldn't have seen the world. I wouldn't have stepped into my own journey. That required me leaving them, of course, not only physically, but psychologically. But at the same time, I had a journey to live. And sooner or later, you have to have a loyalty to the summons of your own soul. And that sometimes means leaving the good intentions of those who have been with you from the beginning.
Well, Jim, this has been an incredibly meaningful conversation, really thought-provoking. I think my audience is going to get a lot of value out of this. If they want to connect with you or buy one of your books or learn more about what you do, where's the best place to do that?
Well, certainly Amazon has the books if people want to Google them up or go to Amazon or whatever. And I do teach courses online for once in a while. And also there's some podcasts at my website. I'm not taking any new clients. I'm just filled. So there are some good resources in your community. And I would wish people just to take their journey very seriously and realize, it's not so much what you do, it's what it's in service to inside. And have you really honored this precious gift of life? And if not, when are you going to do that? It's never too late. So I wish you well, and wish each of those who are watching today well.
It's never too late. That's a great way to end our convo. So Jim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast once again. The audience, like I mentioned, I think is going to really, really enjoy this conversation.
Welcome, Doug. Be well.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.